Hey there, podcast family. Shaun Tabatt here. After a long hiatus, Randy Kay and I are back today for a special episode of Two Christian Dudes. Earlier today, we sat down with writer and director Stephen Gray to talk about his brand new film, After Death, that is releasing in theaters this week. If you want to get tickets, head on over to angel.com/after death and reserve your tickets for your local theater. Before we get to that interview, I'm going to share the trailer for Randy's and my new book. I know some of you have seen the trailer that I made for Near Death Experiences, but it turned out so darn cool. I'm going to share that with you all again. So in just a moment, I'm going to share that trailer, and then we will get on to the interview. We all have an appointment with death one day. But what happens when we cross over to the other side? Find out that and more in a brand new book by Randy Kay and Shaun Tabatt called Near Death Experiences, 101 short stories that will help you understand heaven, hell, and the afterlife. Available wherever great books are sold. Thanks for taking the time to watch the trailer for Near Death Experiences. If you haven't picked up your copy yet, head on over to realndestories.com. We got links there to retailers where you can pick up your very own copy. And without further ado, here is Randy's and my conversation with Stephen Gray. Enjoy. Welcome back to another episode of the Two Christian Dudes podcast. It has been a long time since you have seen Randy and me together in this venue, but we came out of our temporary retirement to bring you a wonderful interview. There's a great new film that is coming out this week called After Death. And we have the opportunity to sit down with the writer and director, Stephen Gray. So, Stephen, welcome to Two Christian Dudes. We're so excited to speak with you.
I'm very excited to speak to you as well. Thanks for having me on.
Well, my first question, I always love to get a bit of the backstory before we get into the meat of the interview. Did you always want to be a filmmaker when you grew up? How did you fall into this unique space?
I'm not sure if I always knew that. I mean, obviously, films had a big impact on my life as a child. One of my first movie experiences was Jurassic Park. I don't think I ever thought that I would be entering this space. But I've been a filmmaker for about 15 years now, and most of my work has been in the commercial space. A lot in Canada, so a lot of commercials in Canada. And yeah, this is my first feature film.
All right, Randy, over to you, sir.
Well, Stephen, I know that that you had a personal experience within your own family that kind of led you to an interest in the afterlife. Tell us about that, please.
Yeah, so in 2012, my brother-in-law Marco, he was killed by a drunk driver, and that really challenged us as a family. And then it's my wife's only sibling. And I've known him for about 20 years, and was very close to him. So seeing him here one moment, gone the next, was really challenging. I just began to ask questions about the reality of life after. I grew up in a Christian home. I went to church all my life. I accepted Christ when I was 11 years old, and but for whatever reason, 2012, it just was really shaky ground with my faith. And I wasn't sure if I really believed in heaven. I wasn't sure if it was just wishful thinking. Sorry, we got a helicopter flying by here. Yeah, and so basically, I kind of came upon these stories of people who had, clinically died and had these experiences and came back by recommendation. I had some friends and family that my mother-in-law actually was, she had heard of these stories, and she's like, I think these will be a great comfort. And I'm not a big reader at first, and so I confess I didn't read the books at first that were recommended, but it was an audio interview that I came across with this guy, Dr. Richard Eby, and he talked about he had fallen 2 stories and his head had cracked open, and the way he described what he experienced with such articulate detail, and he went on about this whole experience, walking with Jesus and what his body form was like in a spirit and all of that. And I was like, what on earth is this guy doing? this is amazing. Like, I've never heard any of this before. I don't know, it caught my attention more than anything else had. And then I couldn't get enough. I read something like 30 books cover to cover. Um, and I couldn't get enough, and then I watched everything I could about near death experiences. But to me, there was something amazing about not just the individual stories, but sort of the layering of multiple stories. This many books is these many stories, and they're from people from very different backgrounds, um, and yet their experiences seem to overlap. And I found something really interesting about that. John Burke wrote this book, Imagine Heaven, which I also read. Later. This is right before I kind of began telling these stories. I thought he did a really good job of kind of doing that, putting it together from a high level, all of these accounts and how they do overlap. And I felt like that's a perfect kind of roadmap for the film. So yeah, I went out and told one story to begin with. I told Captain Dale Black's story in a short doc called Discovering Heaven. He's a pilot who died in a plane crash, 1969, in Burbank, California, with two other pilots. And I wasn't sure what would become of it. If that's all that it ended up being, it's okay. But I was always hoping to do a feature length, and it caught the attention of some people, and I ended up connecting with Jens and Jason of Cipher Studios, who put out a beautiful film called The Heart of Man in 2017, which is a cinematic kind of retelling of the prodigal son story. And once I saw that, I was like, I think these guys, they're doing a really complicated, heavy subject in a really beautiful, meaningful way. And I thought it was very similar to the approach that I wanted to do with the idea of this film. And so I connected with them, and the rest is history. But I've worked on this film now for about 7 years. It's a long time.
And in terms of the people that you chose to be a part of the film, you have an interesting range. Some of them have very positive heaven experiences. Howard Storm has what we might call, in part, a disturbing or distressing NDE. So I feel like you really covered a broad range. In terms of who you selected, the folks you decided to put in the film, talk to us a little bit about that rationale, that process for you.
Yeah, so I kind of had two criteria in the selection of the people we included. One of them was for the skeptic, and our two producers are a lot more skeptical than I was. I'm multiple years into this, became convinced along the way that these are real, but the two producers were not convinced, and it was helpful to have that going in, and kind of having that tension as we went into it. But one of them would be that there had to be a lot of evidence surrounding their death. So it's one thing to kind of believe what they saw and experienced, and some of that could be corroborated, but another thing entirely also to what kind of evidence surrounded the way they died. So and there's so many different near-death experiences out there, but we kind of just wanted to keep the skeptic in mind, which is a big kind of audience member we felt to have their voice in the film. So if there's eyewitnesses, if there's doctors, if there's medical transcriptions or doctors' notes or an investigation or something into what happened, at least to kind of corroborate. So that was one element. Another one was we were kind of trying to find people that potentially had a lot to lose in telling their story. Many of the people that are in our film, in the professions that they're in, did have a lot to lose in telling their story. Howard Storm, who you just mentioned, is I think one of the stories where he stood to lose the most. He was an atheist professor. All of his colleagues and friends, none of them had a faith background at all or belief in anything after. And he had, a very distressing, hellish near-death experience. But then he was also saved. And, he called out to God, and Jesus came and rescued him from that place. And then, he comes back and his whole life is transformed. He can't live that same life again. And so, years later, he ends up, leaving that profession, taking 90% pay cut, and then becoming he becomes a minister for the rest of his life. And his wife had walked out on him, and his kids had left him. So he lost everything, and still, for him, it was worth that. I'm not going to say this didn't happen. This did happen. So it's total transformation. Dr. Mary Neal is an orthopedic spine surgeon. You know, same kind of thing. She's a introvert. First of all, she doesn't like really opening up and putting herself out there. And then she's a doctor. You know, and she's a practicing, you know, spine surgeon. So all her colleagues and all that. It's a little bit crazy for her to come out and say that she had this heavenly experience, and yet she does. So those are kind of two things we were chasing. But as we were coming across these stories, you know, it became very apparent that there's also these hellish experiences. So we have three people in the film who had a hellish near-death experience.
So, Stephen, we've seen a number of these experiences that have been shared, kind of in light of what one might call universalism, or even New Age. How would this address the Christian audience? Is it Christ honoring, for example? And how did you select the guest in terms of their own personal belief, whether it be in Christ as their Lord and Savior, or whether it be some other motivation?
Well, so, you know, early on, before we started making the film, again, just kind of meeting these people and interviewing as many as I could, you know, I was really asking the question, you know, is there something after, and exploring it. And I just needed to know for myself. And so, I kind of had that open-handed, I guess, and when I was asking those questions. And so I just, you know, I really wanted to explore people from everywhere who had these experiences. What I was finding, that it's like, yes, there are cases where people have a near-death experience and they don't come back and follow the Christian faith, which, you know, for me was very sad. But I would say majority of the people, though, that I came in contact with did come back, and either, you know, if they were Christian before, it just deepened their faith, or if they didn't have any belief at all, that they eventually found their way to becoming a Christian or a Christ follower. Many of the people who had a near-death experience and had no religious kind of context, like Howard would be one of them, but there's a few of them. Steve Kang in our film, he grew up Buddhist. And he had a profound, you know, experience. He actually had a hellish experience at first, and it's interesting, this voice, which I believe is the voice of God. He wasn't sure what it was, but it was coming from outside of himself. In this experience, told him before he woke up. It was he said, "Steve, I love you. No more Buddhism. No more drugs." And at that time, you know, he was kind of in the party scene, and he knew when he had this experience that, you know, you can have all these different kind of like preconceived notions of what the afterlife is, and you can get all philosophical about, you know, like, I think it's this and I think I can do that. And his whole belief system in being a Buddhist was that you can, if you go to hell, which may exist, there's these different realms and you can get yourself out of it. You know, you can work yourself up out of it. And so that's there's sort of a whole belief system, which is, I think, in the New Age as well, where, you know, you're kind of your own savior, right? And so you have to do all this work, and that continues in the afterlife. You know, you can get yourself out of these situations. Well, Steve was very surprised when he died, that when he's going into this hellish realm, that he said there's a different set of rules. You know, he's entering this space which he would call eternity, and you can't get, you know, the same rules that exist here on Earth, where you can maybe try to get yourself out of a situation and you may have some agency over you know, your own life here. Doesn't apply there. Whatever you did here in this life is what's going to happen to you in the afterlife. That's a lot of people's stories, and so I would just say that across near-death experiences, what they report almost perfectly overlaps, and what they interpret of what that experience was and what they kind of take home, you know, may be different. Someone, you know, not everyone, like I said, ends up Christian, which is unfortunate, but that's up to them. Every person's kind of responsible for their own kind of spiritual walk and spiritual journey. But what they actually experience and what they report of the experience, you know, like I say, almost perfectly overlaps.
And Stephen, I'm sure along your journey, you found that so many of the people who've had these experiences talk about the difficulty of expressing what they saw, that, you know, we just don't have vocabulary here on Earth half the time to capture it. I'd love to hear some of the challenges you face, in the sense that the film is visually stunning. You've got great reenactments. You've got great kind of cut scenes with voiceover trying to express what the guests are narrating. But was it challenging to try to show some of what they describe on screen? I mean, they talk about how we don't even have these colors here on Earth, and yet you want them to feel like, man, you really captured my story. What was the difficulty in that?
Oh yeah, like honestly, this is probably the hardest film for me as a filmmaker to try and venture into, because yeah, like you say, almost everyone that I talked to, they all said, in their own way, that there's no language on Earth, and we interviewed people from all around the world, and some of them, English is not their first language, and they would say that even their other native language, there's no words to describe what they saw and experienced, but they'll try, because we're getting them in a seat to talk about it. But then again, like you say, I'm challenged to, we're going to try and show some of that. So, we're never going to do it justice. I don't think any visual effects or filmmaker in the world can even scratch the surface. But we try, and so we took kind of a bit of an artistic approach to make it more cosmic. As a kid, I always looked up into the sky and was always wondering about the galaxy and the stars above us. It's just amazing that this creation and that space is just unending. Like, what is that? It's just incredible. And so we kind of base some of the imagery in what we're seeing in galaxies and sort of the celestial realm, above us. And so that was kind of the grounding element to have something that we can kind of tangibly, point to. But then it was also nature. That was a big part of people's experience. So we included a variety of landscapes from around the world. We hired drone pilots from many places around the world, including Norway and even Southern California here, to try and get a variety of landscapes to kind of point to the nature of heaven and how big it is.
The grandiosity of it all, Stephen, is something that is almost impossible to capture. Then there's the other element in terms of the expression of God Himself. Jesus. That is a grandiosity on a whole different level. So, how do you accurately portray the love of Jesus Christ and all of the other facets of God in light of maybe some preconceptions out there as to what He's like? How do you accurately portray Him?
It was also the hardest thing to do. One of the things that kind of, for a lot of it, I was really inspired by what people were describing. And so Dale would say, and many of the other people who had these near experiences and met Jesus or saw God or could see the light of God from heaven, they would say that if they're describing Christ, that it's a man made of light that's like the equivalent of 1,000 burning suns. And so it would be, as they describe, if you're standing before this man in the flesh, you would be incinerated. It's terrifying. And yet, it's standing before him in heaven. It's like, it's the most, beautiful, overwhelming, powerful sense of love. It's unconditional love. And love is a word here in English that, again, words don't do justice. We use love here like, I love this shirt and I love my wife. Those are two very different, expressions of love. This is an unconditional love, agape love. This is a love that we can't feel or express here on earth. It's only experienced in heaven and in God's presence. It's a pure love. It's a holy love. And Dale said at one point, I think in my interview with him, that the closest, because I was asking, is there anything on earth that makes you think of what you saw in heaven? And he said, there's one thing that brings him to tears visually, that makes it about as close as it's ever going to get here on earth to what he saw. And he says it's actually the detonation of a nuclear bomb. If there's video footage of these nuclear tests, and he says the first split second before the shock wave, the first bright shining light, he says that's like a dull, dumbed down version of what he saw of this man made of light. And so we were inspired by that to kind of have some of that brought into the film and to try and evoke a sense of awe and wonder, and even on a little bit of fear. There's like this trembling of like the holiness of God. And so we kind of demonstrated it with light and like I said, galaxy imagery and all that, and trying to the challenge as a filmmaker is you don't want to give everything away visually. A lot of these descriptions, it's overlaid with narrative, and we want people to also imagine it, right? We're, like I say, we're never going to fully do it justice, and so try and get you there with inspiration, but we want people to kind of imagine it for themselves.
And we're actually recording this during release week for the film. You guys have a big premiere tonight out in California. Stephen, in terms of people finding out more, getting tickets so they can go see it in their local theater, where do we discover all this on the web?
Yeah, so people can go to angel.com/afterdeath, and there you can find your local theater listings. We're actually in over 2,500 theaters now across Canada and the United States, which for a documentary puts us at it's right now in a top 5 all-time release for a theater count, which is incredible. And Angel Studios, our distribution company, they saw the value in this film, and they wanted to get it out to as many theaters as possible. So we're hoping that people show up for opening weekend. As an independent film, it's the most important time to watch is the opening weekend, because that just kind of shows the theaters that there's demand, and then that actually determines how long it's going to play. The opening weekend will determine how long it's going to play in the theaters. So we hope people come out and watch it. And like, we have 14 different people who clinically die between seconds to an hour and 45 minutes in the film. So it's it's a variety of people from all across the world, and I mean, it really just kind of asks the question, what happens after we die?
And if you are a fan of near-death experience stories, as you likely are, if you watch any of Randy's and my content, you need to get out. If you want to see more films like this, you need to get out and show your support for this film. So again, that's angel.com/after death to pick up tickets for your own local theater. And so Film After Death, our guest today, Stephen Gray. Stephen, I want to say thank you so much for sharing with us. Thank you for being long-suffering and taking probably a 7+ year journey to see this film finally released in theaters. But I think it's going to be an important contribution to the discussion that's happening right now in culture on NDEs and the afterlife. And I have no doubt it's going to make an important impact. So, Stephen, thanks for being a guest on True Christian Dudes. We appreciate you.
Oh, thanks so much for having me on.